The observation deck of the Galactic Council station hummed with the quiet confidence of untouchable power. Ambassador Thelgzar of the Kryn Empire stood before the reinforced viewport, his three eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he surveyed the fleet assembled below. Hundreds of warships, each bearing the crimson sigil of conquest, hung in formation like predators circling wounded prey. The human settlement on Epsilon 7 will surrender within the hour, he announced to the assembled delegates. Their so-called guardian is gone. There is nothing left to fear. Commander Kale Thorne had heard enough. He materialized from the shadows of the docking corridor, his form barely more than a silhouette against the sterile lighting. The delegates turned, their various appendages reaching for weapons that wouldn't fire, security protocols that wouldn't respond. Kale had made certain of that. You shouldn't have touched them, Kale said, his voice carrying the weight of a collapsing star. Thelgzar's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. The human returns. Tell me, Commander, do you still grieve for those beasts? They were animals, nothing more. Kale's jaw tightened. 3 years ago he had stood in this very chamber, pleading for the interspecies accord. He had brought Varya and Rurik, not as weapons, but as proof. Proof that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in violence, but in connection, in understanding, in the ability to find kinship with the unlikeliest of allies. Varya, the dragon-like creature from Pyros 9, had been a myth among her own kind, a living engine of plasma and fury who could melt starship hulls with a single breath. Kale had found her dying in a collapsed mine, injured by poachers seeking her crystalline heart. He'd spent 6 months nursing her back to health, learning her language of harmonic growls and electromagnetic pulses. She'd chosen to stay with him not out of debt but friendship. Rurik was different. The massive wolf beast from the frozen moon of Fenrix was the last of his pack, hunted to near extinction for sport by wealthy Kryn nobles. Kale had rescued him from a fighting pit, nearly dying in the process. Where Varya was fire and pride, Rurik was ice and loyalty, a creature whose bond, once given, could never be broken. Together, the three of them had become something the galaxy had never seen. Not master and pets, not soldier and weapons, but companions. Brothers in arms. The Council had called it impossible. Dangerous. They said humans were too unpredictable, too willing to blur the lines between species. When Kale had proposed the Accord, a treaty that would protect sentient creatures from exploitation and establish guidelines for interspecies cooperation, they had laughed. Then they had sent assassins. They came to your farm, Thelgzar continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Such a peaceful little world. Did you really think you could hide them forever? Kale's hands clenched into fists. The reports had reached him 3 weeks ago, transmitted through encrypted channels by a sympathetic Meridian merchant. The Kryn Death Squad had landed on Epsilon 7 under the pretense of a diplomatic mission. They'd waited until Kale was off-world, negotiating a grain contract on the frontier colonies. Varya had fought like the legend she was, her roars shaking the atmosphere as she unleashed waves of superheated plasma. She'd destroyed half the assault force before the quantum disruptors overwhelmed her nervous system, shutting down her ability to generate heat. They'd chained her and carved out her heart while she still lived. Rurik had died defending Varya's body. 17 Kryn soldiers fell to his fangs before they'd brought him down with neural toxins. Even in death, his jaws had remained locked around the throat of their commander. You wanted to send a message, Kale said quietly. Consider it received. He raised his hand and the station's lights flickered. The delegates looked around in confusion as systems began to fail in cascading waves. Emergency bulkheads sealed. Life support indicators blinked red. The fleet outside suddenly found their weapon systems locked, their engines unresponsive. What have you done? Thelgzar demanded. What humanity does best, Kale replied. I learned. I adapted. I found allies. Through the viewport, shapes began to emerge from the darkness between stars. Not human ships, but something else. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Dragons from Pyros 9, their bodies glowing with barely contained fusion. Wolf packs from Fenrix, their vessels crude but deadly. Rock singers from the deep asteroid belts. Sky dancers from the gas giants. Even the crystalline hive minds of the shattered worlds. Every species that had been hunted, exploited, dismissed as lesser. Kyle had spent 3 weeks gathering them, speaking in the languages Varya and Rurik had taught him, sharing the vision of the accord they had died believing in. Not with pretty speeches or diplomatic promises, but with the simple truth. Humans remembered their friends, and they avenged them. "You called them beasts," Kyle said, his eyes reflecting the gathering storm outside. "But Varya taught me that honor burns hotter than any star. Rurik showed me that loyalty runs deeper than any ocean. They were more civilized than this entire council combined." Thelgzar reached for his communicator, but it crumbled to dust in his hand. The work of a silicon phase entity Kale had befriended in the Dust Nebula, one whose kind the Kryn had strip-mined for computing power. "You can't do this," the ambassador hissed. "The Kryn Empire spans 1,000 worlds, and every single one of them," Kale interrupted, "is about to learn what happens when you make an enemy of humanity. Not because we're the strongest, not because we're the smartest." He stepped forward, and for the first time the delegates saw what burned behind his eyes. "Because we're the only species in this galaxy that knows how to turn strangers into family. And we never forget our family." The first plasma bolt struck the station's shields, a warning shot from a dragon who had once played in the same fields as Varya. The wolf packs began their howling, a sound that resonated through subspace itself, calling others to the hunt. Kale turned toward the exit, leaving the terrified delegates behind. "The accord will pass," he said over his shoulder. "Not because you choose to honor it, but because you'll have no other choice. And every time you look up at the stars and see them watching, you'll remember 2 names, Varya and Rurik, the friends who changed everything." As he walked away, the galaxy itself seemed to shift. The age of empire was ending. The age of alliance, messy, chaotic, beautiful, was about to begin. And it had all started with a man who believed that friendship was worth fighting for.